Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to talk about several different encounters that individuals may have with ICE, but first I'm going to talk about general tips that you can use to keep yourself safe when you're encountering ICE generally. I think it's important to remember that while you have certain rights that you can assert in specific encounters with ICE, you should always keep in mind that there may be other things that you might want to do instead to keep yourself safe depending on the situation. So it's always about striking a balance between asserting your rights and keeping yourself safe. So we'll talk about those two different things throughout this presentation. So I'll start with just some general tips to keep in mind when you're encountering ICE generally. So the first one is that you always have the right to remain silent. You don't have to answer any questions. The second is that you should never lie to ICE because lying to ICE may impact you criminally in the future. You should be careful to not physically resist or obstruct, but also you should keep in mind that you can always record and document any interaction with ICE, but you should do so safely. We are also recommending that folks carry identification on them. This can be a tribe-issued ID, a state-issued ID, a passport, a photo of your birth certificate. It's just important to keep some sort of identification on you. I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between identification and proving US citizenship, but just so folks know, tribal IDs are a valid form of identification in the United States. And you may be told otherwise, but it's important to remember that tribal IDs are valid federal identification forms. And then also just to keep in mind that if ICE does stop you, it may be safest to comply with ICE orders and to de-escalate the situation by showing your ID or proof of US citizenship if you have it. I'll turn to the next slide, please. So one thing I think that's important for folks to keep in mind is that if you are a United States citizen and you're traveling or you're in the United States, you are not required to carry proof of citizenship while you're in the United States. I think there's been some misunderstanding about whether United States citizens have to prove citizenship when asked by ICE officials. But if you are a United States citizen, there's no federal law that requires you to prove US citizenship or to have proof of US citizenship on you at all times. We are recommending, though, that if you are arrested or detained, that you do show proof of identification, but you do not have to show proof of US citizenship. And as I mentioned before, a tribal ID is a valid form of identification, even though it may not be proof of US citizenship. There's certain encounters with ICE. They can either stop you or they can either arrest and detain you. And if you are stopped by ICE needs reasonable suspicion that you are not legally in the United States to legally stop you. And if you are arrested or detained by ICE, they need probable cause that you are not legally in the United States to arrest or detain you. And what's important here is that ICE is enforcing the immigration laws of the United States. And so their jurisdiction over US citizens is very limited. So in both scenarios, if you're stopped by ICE or if you're arrested or detained by ICE, a tribal ID or a state-issued ID should be enough to rebut those reasonable suspicion or probable cause standards when you encounter ICE. There's a note here that ICE can make other arrests for other federal crimes. We won't get into that too much, but we have seen reports of cases where folks are arrested for interfering with ICE operations or allegedly assaulting ICE officers. But it's important to keep in mind that just as a general principle, ICE does not have jurisdiction over US citizens, and any request for identification can can be accomplished by a tribal ID or a state issued ID. Next slide. So we'll start with ICE encounters at your home. The first thing to remember is to not open the door for an ICE agent unless they present a valid judicial warrant. There are a lot of reports of ICE using administrative warrants, and administrative warrants do not give ICE authority to enter your home without your permission. It's only a valid judicial warrant that will give ICE the authority to enter your home. If ICE says they have a warrant, it's important that you ask what kind of warrant and that you ask to review it. But you should not open the door to receive the warrant. You can ask them to hold it up to a window or hold it up to a screen, but make sure that you just review it before you open your door. We are hearing reports of ICE entering homes without your permission or without a valid warrant. And so if that is the case, be careful to not physically resist, but always maintain that you do not consent to ICE's presence inside your home. I'll turn to the next slide. So the next two slides are examples of a administrative warrant and a judicial warrant. So on this slide, it's an example of an administrative warrant, and the next slide is a judicial warrant. And the best way to tell the difference between the two is that the administrative warrant is typically signed by an ICE officer themselves, and a judicial warrant is signed by a judge. So you can see that documentation at the top of the warrant. And then if we turn to the next slide, you can see that this is signed by a district court judge or a magistrate judge. We are also hearing reports that ICE is alleging that they do not need judicial warrants to enter homes. And so, that's probably an issue that's going to be litigated in the future. But regardless of if ICE enters your home with or without a valid judicial warrant, always keep in mind that you should always voice that you do not consent to ICE entering your home. I'm hearing some reports that people can't hear me very well. I'll try and speak up, and my volume is on as high as it goes, so I apologize for that. We'll turn to the next slide. So this is more information about your home. If ICE enters your home, if ICE begins to search your home without a valid warrant, make sure you clearly voice that you do not consent to them being inside your home or them searching your home. You always have the right to remain silent. And if you choose to remain silent, if ICE is asking you any questions, it's important to say clearly that you are exercising your right to remain silent. As always, do not lie, because lying may impact you in the future. So an example of this may be ICE enters your home and they're asking you where Matt is. You should never say something like, I don't know who Matt is. Matt's not here if Matt is there. And if you do know Matt, you can just respond by saying, I am exercising my right to remain silent. You should always record or document as much of the encounter as you safely can. And we're advising folks to document the encounter in a voice recording or writing it down or telling a friend after the encounter ends. I'll turn to the next slide. This is about encounters with ICE in your car. Typically, you must pull over if you are stopped by any type of law enforcement officer, including ICE. It's important to keep in mind that ICE agents don't always use clearly identifiable cars or clothes. Sometimes they wear clothes that say police. Sometimes they just wear plain clothes. Sometimes they're in unmarked vehicles. So it may be hard to tell who is approaching you or who is stopping you. You're always allowed to ask whoever is stopping you to identify themselves. You can ask what their name is, what law enforcement agency they're from, what their badge number is. They may not provide that information to you, but you are allowed to ask. If the ICE agent or a law enforcement agent comes to your window, you're only required to roll your window down if an officer asks you to. but we are hearing reports that ICE has been opening car doors or breaking car windows before folks have a chance to roll down their window or open their door. So we're reminding folks that you'll want to gauge the situation, and if you're asked to roll down your window for clear communication. I'll go to the next slide. This is a slide about an ICE agent asking for identification. So if you are a driver and an ICE agent asks for your ID, you're required to show a driver's license. And if an ICE agent asks for your ID and you're a passenger, you're not required to provide your ID or any personal information unless you're being detained. But for passengers, we're advising that it still may be the safest option to provide identification or some sort of ID that shows proof of citizenship if you are the passenger. Next slide. It's important to remember that if ICE asks you to get out of the car, always ask for a reason why you're being asked to get out of the car, why you were stopped, and ask the ICE agent to identify themselves before you got out of the car. Again, when it comes to searching your car or your person, ICE usually must have a valid judicial warrant to do so. So if they begin to search your car without a warrant, always remember that you can mention and note that you do not consent to the search. That's the case for any type of search, whether that's your home or your car. Always remember that you can voice that you do not consent to the search. We're getting some reports of ICE detaining or stopping or arresting people who are following them or filming them. And it's important to remember that it's not illegal to follow or film an ICE agent, but if you do so, you should do so from a safe distance and avoid physically obstructing any ICE operations. Next slide. So the slide is about ICE encounters in public or at work. They are pretty similar as far as knowing your rights for both types of encounters. ICE can enter public spaces, including areas of the workplace that are open to the public without any type of warrant. ICE can enter just general public spaces like restaurants or public parks. So ICE doesn't need a warrant to just enter public spaces generally, but they cannot enter private spaces in workplaces. And those are typically designated as employee-only areas. So we are advising folks that it's important to keep an area in the workplace as employee-only areas. If you're approached by ICE at work or in public, do not panic, stay calm, and avoid running or making sudden movements. Once again, if you're asked about another person, whether it's a colleague or another person that is at your work, you don't have to provide any information to the ICE agent. You can also say that you're choosing to exercise your right to remain silent. You're always allowed to ask if you're free to leave. If the agent says yes, you can calmly walk away. And if you're not free to leave, you can ask if you're being detained. And if so, we'll talk about detainment on a slide that's coming up. You can go to the next slide. Unfortunately, we're hearing a lot of reports of ICE encounters with minors, and so it's important to remember for minors that they have the same protections as adults. You have the right to remain silent. You don't have to answer any questions. You don't have to answer any questions about your family members, your parents, where you live. And if you do choose to remain silent, always remember that you can say, I am exercising my right to remain silent. Once again, minors are, like others, are not legally required to carry proof of citizenship on them or identification on them if they are unless they are operating a vehicle. But we do recommend folks carry some sort of identification on them. And if you're going to carry a birth certificate or a passport or something like that, minors may want to put those documents in a sealed envelope and label them confidential. If you are a minor and you are detained and you're detained with your parent, you do have a right to be close and in touch with your parent. Next slide. And these are the slides about if you are detained. So in any of those previous scenarios, if you're at work or in public, or if you are in a car, you may be just stopped by ICE, or you may ultimately be detained by ICE. And so these are the steps to take if you're detained by ICE. Once again, stay calm, do not resist. You can, as we've mentioned plenty of times, it's always your right to exercise, your right to remain silent. You can always say, I am exercising my right to remain silent, and you don't have to answer any questions. But if you are detained by ICE, we are recommending that if you are also a US citizen, you say, I am a US citizen, and ask why you're being detained. We are recommending that folks show a form of identification if they are detained. This can help de-escalate the situation or rebut those reasonable suspicion or probable cause standards that we mentioned earlier. And a tribal ID, as I mentioned, is a valid form of identification. In some cases, ICE agents may not accept a tribal ID as a valid form of identification. And in those cases, you are allowed to ask for a supervisor because it is required that ICE accept tribal ID as a valid form of identification. We'll turn to the next slide. If you are detained, you are allowed to tell ICE that you have medical issues or need to arrange for childcare. And if ICE does not speak your language, you are allowed to request an interpreter for any conversation with ICE. Next slide. We're recommending that folks who believe they may be at risk for detainment make a safety plan, and a safety plan can be as comprehensive as you want, but here are some items that we recommend people include in a safety plan. The most important is memorizing an emergency contact and their phone numbers. Another tip is providing your child's school or daycare with your emergency contacts, keeping important papers like birth certificates, medical records, children's medical records in a safe place, keeping copies of your birth certificate or other proof of citizenship with you, and also giving an emergency contact authorization to make decisions on behalf of your child in the event you are detained. This is also a link to ICE's online detainee locator. So if a loved one is detained, you can use their name and where they were detained to look up where they might be located. Next slide. And the last thing we're recommending for individuals is to document everything after you're released or after the ICE encounter ends. So some of those tips include writing down or making a voice note of what happened, and including things like badge numbers, the names of ICE agents, how many ICE agents you encountered, what they said, what they did. And also we recommend that you take pictures of any damage to your car, your property, or injuries that you incurred. We are also recommending that if you were injured, that you seek medical attention to document those injuries and address what happened. And we're also recommending that you discuss any encounter with ICE with an attorney. And if you have any questions about an encounter with ICE, we welcome you to contact us at the Native American Rights Fund. Happy to answer any questions later regarding this part of the presentation, but I'll turn to Matthew. Thanks.